Hey everybody, this is Dr. Maples. Today we're going to continue our series on social change in Appalachia by talking about the West Virginia Mine Wars. Now, the West Virginia Mine Wars are a series of historical events leading to the largest armed insurrection on U.S. soil since the Civil War. We're going to begin our conversation about the West Virginia Mine Wars by looking at its starting point. That would be strikes at Paint Creek and Cabin Creek in 1912 and 1913. This gives us a great chance to meet the major players in the West Virginia Mine Wars and understand a little bit of its historical background, while also applying some of the ideas we've already learned in our Social Change in Appalachia series. We got a lot to do today, so let's get started. So Paint Creek and Cabin Creek are an important part of understanding the history of coal in West Virginia and in central Appalachia. Now, geographically, they're not very far apart. The spots where Paint Creek and Cabin Creek link into the Kanawha River is only about 6 miles apart across US 61. And fun fact, if you've ever driven I-64 headed through the West Virginia coal fields, there's a decent chance that you crossed Paint Creek and Cabin Creek and even drove alongside them and probably didn't even realize it. In fact, unless you just know the importance of these two locations, they're just small signs on the roads and they seem almost inconsequential. But I can tell you, if we go back in time to 1910 and the decades after that, these were amazing, vibrant coal communities with developed coal camps and lots of mining activity. In fact, if we go back to the 1910s, Cabin Creek alone held 55 mines, while Paint Creek had 41. Altogether, the two locations had 7,500 miners and 35,000 residents. Now, if you look at that map today and realize what a rural area this is, that was huge to have that many people there. One important separation between these two locations, however, was that Paint Creek had unionized under the United Mine Workers and Cabin Creek had not. In fact, this particular issue ends up becoming what really sparks the West Virginia Mine Wars. So why a strike in Paint Creek and Cabin Creek? Well, conditions were a big part of that, living conditions as well as work conditions. It was a rough place to live. Charles Elliott was one of the government officials who came to the area to try and understand what had happened and also to testify on these conditions. And he famously noted that God is everywhere on land and sea, but he's not visited Paint Creek and Cabin Creek recently. And that really says a lot. But we have to even put that into context. To be honest, the United Mine Workers of America had long wanted to unionize the West Virginia coal fields. They had some areas that they'd had great success in, but largely mine operators had resisted unionization throughout these West Virginia coal fields. So whenever we saw issues with conditions, this created an opportunity for the UMWA to stir up a strike and to have some results and hopefully expanding their territory. Now, one of the unique playing pieces in this situation is also that Paint Creek was already unionized, whereas Cabin Creek was not. And in 1912, because of conditions, Paint Creek votes to go on a strike. They do a work stoppage. But strategically, the UMWA now sees an opportunity that they can get Cabin Creek, just 6 miles down the road, involved in this process and expand their territory in the meanwhile. The leaders for the Paint Creek strike are all what we call rank and file members. These are people who are coal miners. They include Bill Blizzard, Frank Keeney, and Bill Mooney, all of which are involved throughout the West Virginia Mine Wars. But Bill Blizzard is especially of note. Now, Bill began coal mining at age 10 and had a very formative experience when he and his family were evicted from a mining tent camp at gunpoint and even shot at. This resulted in a very strong support of the Union throughout the rest of his life and also his family's life. Now, his dad was a coal miner, Timothy, and his mom, Sarah, was also a very famous Union activist who would appear several times in UMWA's history. At age 19, Bill ends up being part of this Paint Creek strike and is one of the leaders, and ends up being eventually elected as president of District 17 of the United Mine Workers Association. This is not the last time we're going to hear his name. So our interest in Paint Creek and Cabin Creek begins with a strike. What is a strike? Strike is a collective decision by workers to put down their tools and stop work until a renegotiation happens over wages, safety, policies, whatever it may be. This most often happens under the guidance of a union. Now, unions are organizations that workers can join and pay fees to be a part of and have someone come in and negotiate the contracts for everyone at that site. When we hear the phrase a union shop, then that means there's a union representative who is representing that particular location and who is responsible for overseeing contract issues, safety and policies and so forth, and also making sure that the contracts are paying well and that everyone's living up to their agreements. With a union strike, there's a decision as part of negotiations to stop work until the employer addresses issues. It's the last step, however. Most of the time, strikes don't need to happen. Even just the threat of a strike is generally enough to get some negotiations happening. Now, think about this in terms of like individuals trying to renegotiate their contracts, right? As an individual, you probably don't have a lot of power to tell your employer what to do. But if you get all the individuals together, you actually have a lot of power, especially if everyone is willing to say they'll stop work. They're the last step tool, though, because they are costly for everyone. Everyone loses money on a strike. And some of the responses on the employer's side to a strike generally include things like negotiations, but also strike breaking, which is where we use force, economic power, and so forth to basically force union workers to stop striking and go back to work. In other cases, they may devalue the power of the strike by sending in what we call scab or non-contract workers. By the way, don't throw the word scab around to just anyone because that's fighting words in a lot of places where many of us are from. We use it as a very negative term here, but we use it for historical context. A scab would be someone who is hired solely to replace a unionized worker with the agreement that they aren't going to be unionized and that they will break through the strike line and go into these shops that have been closed by the workers. It's a very negative thing, but it's the way that people make money. In fact, there's even folks who would go from place to place being strike breakers in situations like this. You could also just wait it out, right? But generally speaking, some kind of negotiation would come out of a strike. We can sign a contract and everyone goes back to work. Paint Creek and Cabin Creek, things went a little different. From a historical perspective, the requests of the miners at Paint Creek and later at Cabin Creek, they're not a surprise. They're the same thing that we see across all mines. First off, they wanted the right to freedom of assembly and to organize. They wanted the ability to establish a union if they wanted to and to not be stopped by the company. Moreover, they wanted the ability to organize and have protests and say what they wanted to in public without retribution. Things that the Constitution says that all American citizens get. They also wanted, to stop no hire lists. This was where if you caused problems for one mine owner and you were fired, then you would be put on a no-hire list, and this would be circulated through other companies. So if you tried to find work at another mine, even if it might be several towns or even states over, you would struggle to get that job because you were on the no-hire list. They also wanted to stop the compulsory use of the company store. Remember, we talked about company stores, workers being paid in scrip, which was basically monopoly money, and being, forced to buy stuff from the company store because that was their only option. Miners here were asking for an opportunity to have some alternative to that. And gosh, maybe that included being paid in something other than scrip. They also wanted to stop cribbing and use a standardized ton. Now, cribbing is a process where coal carts could be designed to hold more than they actually were supposed to. Say a coal cart was designed to hold 2,000 pounds. Well, companies could purchase coal carts or redesign them so that they would actually hold 2,500 pounds. And a miner wouldn't necessarily realize this. They would load the cart thinking it was 2,000 when in fact it was 2,500, but the worker would only be paid for the 2,000 instead of the 2,500. They wanted to really stop this because this was a big area for abusing miners. Similarly, too, union workers wanted to be involved in the check process. Now, checking is where when you roll your cart to the top of the mine and they begin measuring what you have mined and how they're going to pay you, they can determine there's things in there that aren't coal, say that there's clay or iron deposits. And these are things that would affect the weight but aren't actually coal, and you ideally would not have put those in there. Well, if you have company-owned checkmen, they would basically be able to say, oh, there's lots of coal in this one, but there's also a whole bunch of clay. We're not going to pay you as as much for it. The union asked to have someone involved in that process, and also to verify when there were deductions because of checks made that they were legitimate. Finally, they wanted the union to be recognized as legitimate and official. And this kind of goes back to that first point that they wanted the right to organize. Again, none of these are surprising. And if we think about it in a perspective, many of these are things that we would expect from our employers today, but these were not things that were necessarily available to miners in West Virginia's coal fields. Now, early on in the proposal for a strike at Paint Creek, the UMWA and Bill Blizzard float the idea that Cabin Creek, just 6 miles away, should still be included as part of this strike because the conditions that are applying to Paint Creek also apply to Cabin Creek. Now, the whole thing here in the context of this, of course, this gives the UMWA an opportunity to expand their territory and to unionize yet another mine, whereas from a coal mine operator's perspective, they probably did not want that to happen. And to some degree, this probably frames the negotiations that are happening here, with Bill asking that Cabin Creek be included in his negotiations. It largely falls flat and a new contract cannot be created. As such, a strike and a work stoppage is officially declared. The first month of it, things are actually kind of boring. There's not a lot to report. Workers leave the mine, they form a protective barrier called a picket line around the area, and they prevent people from coming into the mine to work. In fact, this was the early stage for something that could have gone for a very long time. Instead, what happens is the beginning of one of the dark spots in the history of mining in West Virginia and in Central Appalachia. And that's the involvement of the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. From my perspective as a historian and a political economist, the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency really speaks to some of the power dynamics happening in the West Virginia coal mining communities. Originally founded in Bluefield, West Virginia, the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency operates as a security force for hire from the 1890s until its formal end in 1937. Their original purpose was very innocuous. They were originally paid security to investigate train robberies and to guard payrolls as money moved in and out of coal camps. Now, remember, these were very rural areas. They were very much at risk, and train robberies were still a thing. So they needed security for this because you couldn't easily ask, rural areas to police these issues. Unfortunately, the market kind of changed with time, and by 1910, the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency decides to go in a slightly different direction. The arrival of the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency in May of 1912 really changes things at Paint and Cabin Creek. They arrive to be strikebreakers. Their singular paid purpose, in fact, is to make this strike end and for coal extraction to restart. They go through some familiar approaches used in the past, but they also create some of their own. First off, they use what's called a forced eviction. This means that if you are a union miner who is on strike, you and your family are forcibly evicted from company housing. Now remember, in these coal camps, people lived in company housing. They didn't build their own houses. They would rent as part of their salaries from companies, the coal companies. And as such, the argument from the coal company was, hey, if you're not working, then, we have to evict you. Thing is this wasn't just a you have to leave and people left. No, they were often forced at gunpoint, their belongings strewn across the railroad track as they were forced out of the area. And we have to remember, this is a really rural area. It's not like you could just go rent from somebody else. You basically were now on your own. And on top of that, you likely didn't have transportation in and out of the area. You couldn't use the rails. You were stuck. You were in a very bad situation. And on top of that, you probably didn't have a lot of resources in terms of money, food coming in, any kind of options for other jobs. It was a very bleak scenario. Now, what ends up happening as these workers are evicted, they end up forming tent colonies in some cases, and also in other cases, living in nearby caves. This was going to be fine for the summer, but I have to imagine a lot of people were thinking, hey, we've got a West Virginia winter coming up in, 5-6 months, and this is really going to be a problem by then. We also start to see, too, the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency using some new tactics in terms of their show of force. They build pillboxes, where it's sort of like a mounted gun nest that's protected, overlooking Cabin Creek. They set up patrol lights so they can literally patrol this area day and night to watch for Union activists to come in, to watch for people causing problems, and so forth. And you have to imagine, if you did live in this area and you were working there, that's got to be some pretty major intimidation of knowing, hey, if I join this strike, this is what I've got to fight. On top of that, with the Paint Creek strike, the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency was also bringing in non-contract laborers. They were advertising broadly, hey, we will give you free transportation to come up to West Virginia and work. All you got to do is work in this coal mine, and you're going to work for these wages. And on top of that, you have to promise to be non-union, and we are going to guard you while you work. So there's nothing to be worried about. Yeah, there's some unrest happening up here, but we're going to break it, and you're going to be part of it. Collectively, this really starts to change what could happen in this particular strike. Now, I have to imagine that the United Mine Workers saw the involvement of the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency in their forced evictions policy as a case of we have to fight fire with fire. And it's no surprise that the big guns really start coming out to this Paint Creek strike. That includes activist Mother Jones. Mary Harris Jones was a dressmaker and teacher in a previous life before she became one of the really famous and visionary firebrand union activists of the West Virginia coal mines and more. She's almost folklore at this point in Appalachian history, even as she's a very tragic figure and a flawed figure in some ways because of her ability to motivate people through common language and curse words to rise up and even some cases use violence. Now, she's arriving just a couple of months into the Paint Creek strike, but she drops one of the most famous quotes from this particular cause. I'll give the censored version to you. Arm yourselves, return home, and kill every mine guard on the creeks. Blow up the mines and drive the scabs out of the valley. Yeah, it's powerful stuff. In fact, she used the phrase bloodletting in these hills, which may partly be where the name of this book comes from, and really another famous quote in and of itself, to basically say if the governor of West Virginia doesn't involve themselves, this is what's going to happen. It's going to get bad. Well, kind of the irony in this is actually Governor Glasscock from West Virginia did get involved. He makes an offer to arbitrate between the striking miners at Paint Creek, the folks at Cabin Creek, and also the mine operators for both locations. And it's the mine operators, fun fact, that actually reject his requests. This is where things really start to get out of hand. And there's going to be bloodletting in Appalachia. The sniping and skirmishes in the area result in what's called the Battle of Mucklow. Mucklow is a small village on Paint Creek, and there we see mine guards fighting against striking miners in a case where over 100,000 bullets are fired, houses are riddled with bullet holes, and 16 people are estimated to be killed. 4 of these are confirmed deaths of mine guards. The remaining ones are estimated deaths for the striking miners. Things really get worse, though, September 1st. This is where we see people on the northern end of things, north of Kanawha River, that are striking miners decide to join the conflict. They arm themselves to the teeth and, in the words of Mother Jones, are coming down to kill all the mine guards. They are now moving south, basically a small army of roughly 5,000 to 6,000 people coming into this situation. Now you can imagine at some point that the state and federal folks are really freaking out about this conflict getting out of control. September 2nd, the state government gets involved to try and quash this rebellion that's happening not too far from their state capital. First off, they send in 1,500 state militia to try and get a grip on things. Those 1,500 state militia had been circulating in the area, but then were rushed in when they realized this thing was about to explode on September 2nd. Now, they come into the area, and one of their first tasks is actually starting to demilitarize the situation by rounding up guns from both sides. They end up seizing something like 2,000 guns and 100,000 rounds of ammunition between the two sides, both coal camps and the coal miners. And we can only imagine how many rounds of ammunition and guns were hidden on top of that. Now, this helps because it kind of helps to pull things back from the brink of disaster. But there's another issue. The state governor also declares martial law for the strike district. This is a problem for the miners because it gets rid of things like their ability to organize, to congregate in one place, and it also creates the ability for martial courts to exist. Martial courts don't adhere to the same number of rules that a normal non-military court would have. So they're very quick. You can be sentenced without a lot of evidence. You can even be tried in groups of like 15 and 20. There were 66 different cases of martial courts being held. Most of them were miners being given short times in the local jail. Some of the mine leaders were being sentenced to longer terms in penitentiaries. Of note, one of the people that ends up being arrested during this process is also Mother Jones, who's arrested for reading the Declaration of Independence because people think it's sort of this unionist effort to create a revolution, right? So she ends up being arrested for it. This is a problem because, in one sense, we do see more peace happening. In fact, the martial law regulations would be released in October later that year. But we see that the miners are in a weaker situation now. This is even worse, though, because when the martial law rules are pulled back, the state militia is also released from duty. And almost immediately, the coal operators reach out to as many of these people as they can and hire them as mine guards. So now the state militia, who are here to keep the peace, are now working against the miners. And in some cases, there's apparently some vendettas that are going to be brought out, which is a scary thing. What could make this worse, right? In fact, things get so stressful because of all this that martial law is again declared in November of that year, and it lasts through January. But in the background, remember those forced evictions? We've got all of these families of these coal miners living out in tent camps and in caves. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in West Virginia in the winter, but being in those deep valleys where coal is, they don't get much sunshine. It gets insanely cold. There is a lot of snow. It's just a cold, miserable experience. I can't imagine being in that for a week and the outdoors 24 hours a day, much less trying to live an entire season out there. Things can't get any worse for the miners, right? You have no idea how bad things are about to get. The sad pinnacle of the Paint and Cabin Creek strike happens on February 7th, 1913. It is a cold, dark winter's night in West Virginia. At the time, Kanawha County Sheriff Hill, 6 of his deputies, and 14 armed mine guards boarded a train, and they were headed to serve a warrant on a John Doe who had incited a riot. Along the way, the train would pass Holly Grove. And Holly Grove was one of these communities of mining families and miners who had been removed from company housing and were trying to survive West Virginia's winter in tents. This train, which would come to be called the Bull Moose Special, as it drove past the Holly Grove settlement, had rifles appear from its window, and they began to shoot at the camp. A machine gun nest, which had been conveniently mounted on the top of the train, began to open fire on the camp. They continued to shoot as the train drove past this camp of tents in the middle of the night. It is by sheer miracle that only one person was killed. The camp was decimated with bullet holes, the tents destroyed, many people wounded, and I can only imagine people scarred for life in this happening. There's 2 stories for how this ends, and it's not entirely clear which one mattered or even if they're both accurate. The first one is that Sarah Blizzard, who was the mom of Bill Blizzard, one of the leaders of the Paint Creek strike and a UMWA member, got involved with others in destroying the tracks so that the train would not have been able to come back through on a reverse trip to do this a second time. The second one is that Sheriff Hill himself refused to let the train back up and do it again. Either way, this was the bloodletting in Appalachia that I think everyone knew was going to happen. But I don't know that it was what Mother Jones expected. The Bull Moose Special is hands down one of the saddest events in the history of unionization of coal mines in West Virginia, but it's an event that has major ramifications in how we think about coal in West Virginia and in Central Appalachia as a whole. Almost immediately, outgoing Governor Glasscock of West Virginia goes through the process of returning to martial law for the third time. In fact, it's not until the new governor comes in, here, Henry Hatfield, that martial law is released. He also releases any miners still in jail and prison from the martial courts, as well as releasing Mother Jones, who at this point was in penitentiary and near death. She had not recognized the authority of the martial courts, and so she was sent to prison and was very near death and had to be sort of saved almost from prison and recovered after that. In the end, Hatfield strikes a deal between both sides. He says the miners are going to sign this deal or they're going to be removed. And it's a marginally better deal. In fact, the folks at Paint Creek sign. Cabin Creek fights for an additional 2 weeks before they also, 2 months before they agree to sign. But at that point, Cabin Creek gets its union. At what cost? 50 plus lives. Actually, probably more. We'll never really know how many mining family members starved to death in being removed from company housing and forced to live outside during that cruel West Virginia winter. On a much broader scale, this event did raise a national perspective on the life and struggle of miners in West Virginia, particularly through a cartoon that was in the Associated Press. You know, it's funny because that got people's attention, whereas the government investigations and councils and studies and visits did largely nothing. Nonetheless, things are not over. There is still much more bloodletting scheduled in Appalachia, and much more bloodletting will happen before this event is over. This is just the part one of thinking about the mine wars in West Virginia. Our next visits are going to take us to places like Matewan and the McDowell County Courthouse before we end up at the Battle of Blair Mountain itself. I'd love to hear your comments on what you think about this. Leave them in the comments below. Let me know your thoughts. How would you have addressed this if you lived through this? What would that life have been like? Did you have family members that lived through this? I'd love to hear from my viewers below. On a more somber note than usual, thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to the channel, and I look forward to talking to you more in our next video where we're going to head to Matewan. I'll see you soon.